Alright, hello everybody. Today I just want to be going over Shadow Priest and kind of my thoughts on the current situation of Shadow Priest. For people who don't know, I was playing Shadow pretty much all through Warlords of Draenor. I was playing it pretty heavily in early alpha and beta, pretty much up until they removed two things about the class that I just really hated. And that pretty much, at that point, I just decided I was going to go disc, and I've been disc ever since, so... You know, I'm not happy with the state of Shadow at the moment, so you know, hopefully this video is interesting. So, to the recent changes, they've just increased the rate at which Insanity drains, and they've lowered the initial count. Not by much, not a very significant change. Yet another completely pathetic change to Shadow Priest. It's really not good enough at this point. Something needs to happen to it. They need to just change what's happening with these level 100 talents before it, you know, gets to a viable point. So, for people who don't know, in early alpha and beta, Shadow Priest was a lot different. So, Void Form was a 45% damage increase to be inside it. Just the passive damage increase you got from being in Void Form was 45%. So, what they've done, obviously with the Shadow Form now, they've buffed that by 10% and they've reduced the damage of all your spells, so it's really not as high as it seems, as compared to what it used to be. So it's not, you know, 45% it's what, like 25% additional damage on what it is now. So you used to be doing 25% more damage in Void Form, you know, and your spec was balanced around that. Now, what they did in the alpha and, you know, alpha going into basically late beta is they reworked where the damage is on your spells. So they took a lot of damage out of your single target ability. So they took a lot of damage out of Void Bolt. They took a lot of damage out of Mind Flay and Mind Blast, and they put it all into dots. And then they also gutted Void Torrent. So what this made Shadow Priest to be was they changed it from a real like heavy single target with a decent kind of multi-dotting capacity into a just multi-dotting machine, and then the single target is obviously very strong at the moment because of the Serenade to Madness and how that's working, but ideally the single target shouldn't be that good. So what happened in the early alpha and beta is Legacy of the Void was pretty much the be-all and end-all of this level 100 talents. Serenade to Madness wasn't as good as it was because your Mass Hysteria wasn't as powerful because your dots didn't hit much. Your dots were kind of just applied to the target and then refreshed with Void Bolt constantly. And the idea of Shadow was that you worked up into Insanity, you got into Insanity and did a heap of damage. Whereas now, it's more, your dots are doing all the damage, regardless if you're in or out of Void Form. I know you'd still do a lot of damage with it in Mass Hysteria, but the damage used to be loaded onto things like Void Bolt and other abilities you got inside Insanity, rather than just your Mass Hysteria artifact trait buffing your dots. So, and because there was such a huge base modifier on being in Void Form, Legacy of the Void being at 60 was a significant DPS increase. Whereas now, Legacy of the Void being at 70, it really doesn't matter. You don't even notice the change. Because of how your dots are so imperative to the class, and they also, because of how they generate Insanity now, you're not as penalized as much as you were for recasting them. And that you know, they've nerfed and changed the damage around, so it's always, you know, stayed viable. But just because of how they've changed it now, where it's all around the dots, Legacy of the Void falls off. Mind Spike is a completely other discussion, and we'll get to that later, but that's why you see why Serenade to Madness is so strong, because you have the massive haste, you have your dots scale with haste. You know, they don't have a hard cap. Your dots will never stop scaling with haste. Your Mass Hysteria is, you know, exponential DPS increase when you get into Void Form. So they've pretty much just created this perfect storm of Serenade to Madness being the be-all and end-all, and these other two talents have to be ridiculously strong for anything to be considered to be taken over Serenade to Madness. And there's other problems with Serenade to Madness, like things like the fight length and, you know, things like it being an execute. But Serenity Madness in its current form, even on a 10-minute fight, outplays these other two talents, which is really sad to see. And because of that, you also see things like, you can't take Mindbender because Mindbender is a global cooldown that doesn't get you insanity instantly. So you can't take Mindbender. You're forced into taking Power Infusion. Same thing with Shadow Crash. You're really forced into taking Power Infusion. You're forced into taking Auspicious Spirits. You're forced into taking Reaper of Souls, and you're forced into taking Twist of Fate, all because of this one talent. So it creates a lot of problems with the spec, it being based around this Serenity Madness, and it's really, really sad to see, because Shadow Priest used to be just so much better. Like, in early alpha and beta, you had choices. Everything, had a place, except for Shadow Crash, because it did no damage, but they did change that. But there was a reason to take other talents, so they've really shot themselves in the foot. They had something that was really good and really fun to play, and they've, to get to this dot fantasy where they wanted it, they completely ruined their whole talent system. They completely ruined the whole, I'm going insane, I'm doing more damage. Right now, you kind of get into insanity, and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to be doing slightly more damage, and maybe in 60 seconds, when I get to 60 seconds of my insanity, I'm going to be doing even more. Now, it's not fun. So the other thing that they put in the beta, which was just the most it's just stupid, Void Eruption. So Void Eruption, was meant to be, here's Shadow Priest, you don't have any AoE, so here, have some burst AoE. But then this ability does no damage. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't, if even as like a class fantasy role, as you're supposed to erupt as you're going into as you're going insane, it just doesn't have any reason for it. So Void Eruption is a complete disaster of a spell. If they wanted to implement it, there's two ideas that go around to why it was implemented. It was implemented as a reason, for Void Bolt to be on cooldown, so it kind of slowed down the spec a bit, right? So when you got into insanity, you might have to recast a dot because you weren't quick enough getting back in. Now, they could have done that by just keeping it how it was, where you just had a button to, I'm going to press this and go insane. They could have just had that and then have your Void Bolt go on a cooldown as you pressed it, rather than you getting a shitty, 1.6 second cast that does, no damage. The instant cast spell was a lot better. Void Eruption, did actually decrease the damage over what they had in, without it. When Void Eruption didn't exist, Shadow Priests were doing more damage. So it's a completely flop of a spell, and it's a complete just stupid iteration of to the Shadow Priest. Now, there was the two things that I stopped playing Shadow Priest for was they removed Dominant Mind. Now that's not a Shadow Priest thing in particular, but Dominant Mind used to have a 1 minute cooldown and a 1 minute duration. You could use it in Mythic plus dungeons, and they did the mobs full damage. So in a Mythic plus dungeon, Shadow Priests were one of the best classes. Obviously, the damage was broken on a few things. You could bolster a mob and all the rest of it and completely bug out and stuff. But it was a really fun mechanic to use and gave Shadow Priest something in a 5-man dungeon, yet for some reason they nerfed it, and you have things like rogues and DKs who have a literal better, mind control than the priest, which just, why? Just, they should have just left it. Whoever's on the design team is loopy. Alright, and the other thing that they changed was, well, not that they changed, but when they redid the damage, obviously, as I said before, they pushed pretty much everyone into Serenity Madness. Now, I really, really hate playing Serenity Madness. I really dislike all your damage being, put into the back end of a fight, being a complete execute class. I don't want to play that. I don't want to play around a spec where, you get feared on dragons, you're now dead, sorry, game over. Things happen, you make mistakes, sure, it's a punishing thing to do, way to play. Some people might like the punishment versus reward and all that, but personally, I like consistency. I hate Serenity Madness just because of that reason. I it's not that I'm incapable of playing it. I just don't like the fact that you just you can lag out, you can have something happen, you can mistarget the boss, you can just press one button wrong and you're stuffed, and you might have just lost the kill on your raid boss. So I don't like Serenity Madness for that reason. But the other, like, the thing about the talent and just the way that Shadow Priest is currently working is that it just gives you no choice in what you can do of what a class that used to had a huge amount of choice. So it's really sad to see. So what do we do about it? What can Blizzard change to actually make the class have some choice? Make it so it's not utterly broken. I had up before. I haven't got it, but we'll go get it real quick. How Shadow Priest is performing. So in Emerald Nightmare, you see 75th percentile. Shadow Priest significantly in front of other classes. 50 percentile they'll be above, and this difference only gets exacerbated as you go higher, right? And the thing about it is that, like, you can say, sure, at 100 percentile that people, most people don't play like this, and this is not, a good representation of the class. But if you're talking about, like, high-end raiders, high-end mythic progression guilds, this means you stack the class. This means you bring 4 or 5 of them to a boss, if you need a hidden unraged. Like, it's not what you want to see, and it's something that can't be in the game. This much of a difference, sure, you had this with arcane mages at the end of HFC when everybody had an upgraded ring. Like, that's the end of a tier. That's not going into more progression. That didn't happen in progression. This is happening right now. This will be, tomorrow you'll see Shadow Priest galore in Trial of Valor. So it's a problem. It is a real problem for Shadow, and the thing is, they're nerfing the class in a way that doesn't help the alternative. Everything they're doing is nerfing the class and not Serenity Madness. So what needs to change? They need to change this last tier of talents. It's not ideally, what I would like to see is them going back to exactly how they had it in, like, early beta. I would love to see, your artifact ability actually go back to doing damage, rather than just being something to pause your insanity. That's what you use Void Torrent for at the moment, is just to pause insanity. It's boring. It sucks. So, alright, let's get into the changes. So, Legacy of the Void. This spell, it can go back down to 60, 70. Doesn't matter what the number is for this spell. It's not really going to make a difference on how it is. What it needs to have is a damage modifier in it. So you need to... The idea of Legacy of the Void is it wants to keep you in insanity. It wants to have you the highest uptime of insanity. So if you're looking, maybe at a 6-minute fight or something, average fight length 6 minutes, I would say. So Legacy of the Void should ideally give you a higher uptime in insanity than Serenity Madness. Now, to achieve that, I don't know if 70 is high enough. It's probably not, because Serenity Madness is a little bit skewed, but probably at a 10-minute fight you would want to see Legacy of the Void having a higher insanity uptime than Serenity Madness. So if the idea of the talent is to make you stay in insanity for longer, I want to see a damage buff in insanity. So if you give Legacy of the Void, Void Form now may be cast at 70 insanity and increase your damage done by 10%. Now, if you're hearing this and go, oh, but Shadow Priests are doing really well at the moment, that is because of Serenity Madness. If they don't have Serenity Madness, Shadow Priests suck. Shadow Priests are at the bottom of every class without Serenity Madness. So having a passive damage worked in when you don't have Serenity Madness is perfectly fine. So I would estimate 20% almost is what Legacy of the Void needs to be doing, to be competitive. You don't want... Ideally, the way that Shadow Priest is scaling with multiple targets, it can't be doing the same damage as other classes, single target, because your dots are essentially free damage when you apply it to a second target. You're not losing anything by having 2 targets. In fact, you're gaining stuff because you have extra insanity generation. So Shadow Priests by themselves should not be doing as much single target damage as, say, an Arcane Mage or a Feral Druid or something like that, because they don't lose basically anything dotting a second target. So you would want Shadow Priests, to kind of be behind in the single target, and that's what you want with Legacy of the Void, is for that to be buffing, your multiple target damage, and just, having a flat damage modifier, because that is what the spell is meant to do, keep you on insanity for longer. So, 10, 20%, 25%, I don't know on the exact number. That's something that you just have to play around with, and, whatever. Legacy of the Void should have a damage modifier in insanity on it. Alrighty, so Mind Spike. Now, Mind Spike is an absolute disaster of a spell. Whoever designed Mind Spike just shouldn't have a job working on a balance team. So the problem with Mind Spike is that it puts a dot on the target, and that dot is exploded by a rotational ability. Now, there is no situation where you're not going to cast a Mind Blast. If you're bringing a Shadow Priest for some burst AoE, then you're retarded. So you never want to have, a Shadow Priest is not going to be effective doing burst AoE with Mind Spike, because they lose damage by not casting Mind Blast. Now, not casting Mind Blast is a huge loss for a Shadow Priest. You can't not cast Mind Blast. So this talent, where it's supposed to be, oh look, I can build up a bunch of damage, maybe an extra mob that spawns, and look, I can do double damage with my Mind Spike. Well, cool. But you're losing Mind Blast throughout that entire period, so you're going to be losing a net amount of damage. So what this needs to be is this Mind Blast needs to be changed to an AoE ability. And what AoE ability does Priest have? Mind Seer. So if Mind Spike was to explode when you casted a Mind Seer, which is a AoE ability, onto a mob to proc its AoE damage, it would be perfect. You would have some niche talent, Mind Spike, which can do some burst AoE, and, problem solved. You then have a viable talent. Maybe the damage needs to get buffed to be in line with the other, level 100 talents, but, at least then there is a purpose to this spell. Mind Spike in its current form is a single target DPS loss, an AoE DPS loss at this, by the same token. It is a DPS loss taking this talent. It does more damage than Mind Flay, but because of how it generates insanity after the cast, and it's not a smooth amount of insanity when you're casting it, it is not a DPS increase to take. So the damage probably needs to get buffed for it to be viable, even in this form. But that is how it should work. It should proc off an AoE ability that you cast, or it should proc off just, you get an extra button that goes explode Mind Spike or something. Proccing off Mind Blast does not work. It will never work, and there is no reason for a Shadow Priest to be doing it. So, absolute disaster of a spell. Really, really, really disappointed in, that this even made it into the game, let alone this far. I'm horrified that someone actually can write this tooltip and go, yeah, that's right. That's acceptable. It's not. Okay. And so finally onto Surrender to Madness. So Surrender to Madness is fine. Risk and reward is fine to have in the game. It will always have its use. Now, ideally what I would like to see Surrender to Madness be is to be a niche talent. So you take Surrender to Madness, say, when you're speed killing Ursoc or something, so when you're speed killing Ursoc and it's, a 3 minute fight, you go, okay, cool, I can sit in Surrender to Madness for the entire fight, sweet. That's when you want to be taking something like Surrender to Madness. Or you can have Surrender to Madness be like, okay, even though Xavius was kind of a flop of a fight, you can get up to Xavius and you can be like, well, my damage from 100% to 30% on this fight really isn't that impactful. The only part in this fight that matters might be from 30% to 0. So as a good player, you can go, well, I can do, double the amount of damage as I would otherwise if I take Surrender to Madness. So let's take Surrender to Madness here, and I can be, the hero in the last phase of the boss. That was the initial intent for Surrender to Madness. And just, it still is the intent for Surrender to Madness. It's just because all the damage is loaded into dots, Surrender to Madness is significantly outperforming what it should be. So what do they need to do to change that? They need to buff something that doesn't affect the Shadow Priest, except for the Surrender to Madness talent. Now, they can keep doing these things, like nerfing the amount of insanity and changing the insanity generation, but they are pathetic Bandaid patches. They are just not going to fix the core issue. And the core issue is the exponential scaling you find in mass hysteria. Now, this change was proposed, and the amount of just uneducated people going, oh, this will break Shadow Priests, this Shadow Priests aren't viable. Well, it won't be. It's fine having this reduced damage, and sure, it's going to be a fairly big nerf to Shadow Priests, but it's going to bring them in line with everybody else. So maybe when it was proposed that it was too big of a nerf, but what I propose is to have mass hysteria capped at 50. Now, the other thing you can do, because capping at 50 is kind of like a weird fix, is you can change it to 1%, but if you change it to 1%, you're affecting all the other talents and ways to play the class. So that is not something, that is ideal. I would prefer to see this capped at 50 stacks. At 50 stacks, you will be doing significantly less damage. I think dots are around 70% of your damage in its current form. So 50% less damage is a fairly big nerf to the Shadow Priest. And it's a big nerf to that execute damage. But, why not buff the insanity that Serenity Madness generates? So why not make Serenity Madness something you can sit in constantly, even at max stacks? There's no reason for you to be dropping out. The only reason you really should be dropping out of Serenity Madness is if you stuff up. Hitting a point, people can hit 100 stacks and stay there at, with heroism. It's not that difficult to do. And it's very ping dependent as well. So I would like to see Serenity Madness be something that, you can sustain 100 stacks. You can be in Serenity Madness for 3 minutes. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as your damage isn't, 1.5 million for 3 minutes, it's fine. So if they change this back to how it was originally at 150% insanity generation, and then the capped mass hysteria, so you can sit in Serenity Madness for longer. Serenity Madness is more consistent, but the damage is slightly less. That would be a much better change than all these just terrible changes to how Insanity works, terrible Bandaid changes, and then not addressing the issue that there is no alternative at all to Serenity Madness. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on Shadow. I hope this might spark something to change Shadow Priest. Maybe get people aware of what the core inner workings, what's actually wrong with Shadow Priest at the moment. The last point I would like to just kind of stress the most is that because of how Serenity Madness is working, you have no choice in any of your talents. We have this fantastic talent tree here of a lot of different things to use, but you cannot change from anything in here, otherwise you lose a significant amount of damage. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Leave your comments below, and share this around if you think this might be a viable change. Thanks for watching. Bye.